From the distant past to the grandeur of medieval kingdoms, the allure of power has been a constant, universal force that shaped the destinies of men. Power, real, tangible, and intoxicating, was the dream of many, the prize that kings and would-be rulers sought with unrelenting passion. The idea of sitting on a throne, commanding entire nations, and shaping the course of history was the ultimate reward for centuries of war, struggle, and ambition. Kings were viewed as gods on earth, their every word law, their every gesture a symbol of unchallenged authority. A life of opulence, grandeur, and respect was promised to those who could claim the throne. But is that really the whole story? What if the life of a king, the seemingly endless riches, the grand feasts, the glittering castles was not the golden paradise history has painted for us? What if, beneath the surface of every royal legend, there lurked something darker, more sinister, something that most of us have never been told, something that kings themselves often tried to hide? The image we have of kings is one of invulnerability. We envision rulers sitting comfortably on thrones, crowned with jewels, their subjects kneeling before them in adoration. We romanticize the stories of ancient kings and medieval monarchs, believing that their only struggles were those fought on battlefields. Yet, if we look closer, we find a truth that has been hidden in the shadows for centuries. Being a king, a ruler of men, often came with a cost so high it would make you question whether the crown was worth it at all. Consider this. The very essence of power is fraught with dangers unseen. Kings, though perceived as immortal and invincible, were some of the most vulnerable figures in history. They were constantly at risk, not only from enemies on the battlefield but from their own advisors, from their closest allies, even from their families. What was it really like to live under the weight of a crown? What hidden burdens did these men carry with them every waking hour of their lives? Imagine for a moment the strain of knowing that every decision you make, no matter how small, could change the fate of thousands. Imagine a life where your every move is scrutinized, your every failure magnified. Power, it turns out, is not the shining jewel it seems to be from the outside. It is a double-edged sword, one that cuts deeply into the soul of its bearer. The truth is, those who wore the crown often paid a far greater price than anyone could have imagined. They were trapped in a world of endless expectations, surrounded by scheming men who only wanted their power, and haunted by the knowledge that at any moment their reign could come to an abrupt and brutal end. The allure of power was real, yes, but so too was the toll it took. As we journey deeper into the lives of these rulers, one question will echo in your mind. What is the true cost of power? Was the grandeur they enjoyed truly worth the hidden pain they endured? The answer may not be what you expect, and the deeper we dig, the more unsettling the truth becomes. And so, we are left with the question, how much of what we think we know about kings is nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion? What if the life of the monarch, the very image we've romanticized, was far darker than we ever imagined? As we begin to peel back the layers, we will see how the lives of these kings were often not as they appeared. The lives of men who once seemed invincible will reveal a side most never dared to imagine. And from there, we will discover that the allure of power came at a cost few could ever pay. The crown, a symbol of power and might, often carried with it a weight so crushing that few could bear it for long. From the outside, kings appeared as gods among men, immortal, regal, their reigns unchallenged. But what was the true cost of kingship? What was the hidden toll that these rulers paid for the glory they seemed to command? To understand the dark underbelly of medieval power, we must look beyond the pageantry and into the very lives of those who held the crown. Imagine for a moment the constant threat of rebellion. The moment a king ascended to the throne, a target was placed squarely on his back. The threat of betrayal loomed at every corner. Allies became enemies, and enemies lurked within the walls of his own castle. Richard II, once a promising ruler of England, was struck by a mental breakdown, unable to cope with the endless pressure of his position. His decline wasn't the result of external forces alone. It was the crushing psychological toll of constant fear, paranoia, and isolation. This isolation was a common affliction of rulers. Kings were surrounded by courtiers, advisors, and sycophants, yet they could trust no one. Every decision, every conversation, every look analyzed, scrutinized, and often twisted. Even the most loyal of allies could turn on a ruler if it meant furthering their own ambitions. As the crown grew heavier, the ruler's health often faltered. The mental strain of maintaining control over a kingdom, especially one in constant flux, took its toll in ways that were far from glamorous. Henry VIII's obsession with power and legacy spiraled into a series of personal crises, culminating in his later years where his decisions were more the result of fear and obsession than sound judgment. He faced constant health issues, paranoia, and isolation conditions that seemed to be part of the very fabric of kingship. Power, it seems, was not a comfortable seat but a constant battle. The public may have seen the king's wealth and grand feasts, but few ever glimpsed the fear that gnawed at his mind. Few could understand the endless strain of being a king, the knowledge that one wrong move could undo a lifetime of work. Even worse, the toll this constant strain took on their mental and emotional health was often hidden from the very people they ruled. Perhaps the most insidious part of this burden was the knowledge that their reign would eventually end. Whether through death, betrayal, or defeat, no king was truly immortal. Every monarch lived in the shadow of this inevitable truth, knowing that their power was always temporary. And so, kings often sought to extend their reigns by any means necessary, sometimes at great personal cost. But what did that cost look like in practice? What toll did the quest for eternal power and control over life and death leave on those who sought it? To truly understand kingship, we must look beyond the golden thrones and the public image of strength. The truth, hidden in the shadows of history, is that the real struggles of kings were not found in their victories, but in their failures, the moments of weakness and despair that rarely made it into the history books. And as we peer deeper into the lives of these rulers, the question becomes more pressing. How much of their struggles did they face alone? What if the true cost of power wasn't just the burdens they bore, but the soul-crushing loneliness that came with it? A loneliness, not of physical isolation, but one born from the inability to trust anyone, even those closest to them. In the end, the most dangerous enemy a king faced wasn't always an assassin or a rival ruler. It was the weight of the crown itself. Power, the ultimate game. But in the courts of medieval kings, it wasn't just about wielding a sword or commanding an army. The deadliest battles were often fought in the shadows, behind the walls of the royal palaces, where betrayal, deception, and deadly ambitions festered among the very men who were meant to be trusted. Imagine for a moment stepping into the regal halls of a medieval court. The clink of goblets filled with wine, the murmur of finely dressed nobles plotting in hushed tones. On the surface, all appears serene, a world of wealth, beauty, and grandeur. But beneath that polished veneer lies a battlefield more treacherous than any war zone. Here, in the midst of luxury and lavish feasts, rulers had to navigate a web of constant political maneuvering, where one wrong decision, one misplaced word, could mean the end of their reign. What happens when you can't trust the very people closest to you? When the men you've welcomed into your inner circle, those you've relied on for counsel, for loyalty, turn against you, driven by their own greed, envy, or hunger for power. The courts of medieval kings were far more dangerous than the battlefields they commanded. Take, for example, the assassination of Julius Caesar, one of the most infamous betrayals in history. The leader of Rome, at the height of his power, was stabbed in the Senate, not by an enemy from a foreign land, but by his closest friends. Among those who plotted his death were men he had trusted implicitly: Brutus, his confidant, and Cassius, a fellow general. These were men who had sat at his table, fought alongside him, shared in his victories. Yet, driven by fear of his growing power, they chose betrayal over loyalty. Caesar, the man who had conquered nations, was brought down not by soldiers on the battlefield, but by the very hands he had once trusted. Or think of Richard III, a king whose name has been forever tarnished by the shadow of conspiracy. His rise to the throne was marked by intrigue and manipulation, a master of court politics. Yet in the end, it was these very same machinations that led to his downfall. History has painted him as the villain, the ruthless usurper, but the truth is more complicated. Richard's reign was filled with constant power struggles and betrayals, not just from his enemies, but from those he trusted most. His brother, King Edward IV, had left behind a kingdom filled with ambitious men eager to take his place. Richard's tragic downfall was not due to external armies or foreign invaders, but because his own court turned against him. His reign ended not on the battlefield, but in the treacherous battle of loyalty and trust. The art of betrayal in medieval courts was often subtle, A whisper here, a glance there. Nobles and advisors, driven by personal ambition, would shift allegiances in an instant. Friends would become enemies, and those who swore loyalty to the king could easily plot his death in the name of their own advancement. In the pursuit of power, it wasn't just about having the strength to fight. It was about knowing when to trust and, perhaps more importantly, when to distrust. This deadly game played out behind the velvet curtains, away from the eyes of the public. It wasn't just about defeating an enemy on the battlefield. It was about winning the trust of the right men and knowing when to beware of those closest to you. And yet, the more power a king held, the more dangerous this game became. Because in the world of medieval politics, trust was fleeting, and betrayal could be the sharpest weapon of all. The court was a battlefield in itself, where the price of betrayal was often death. And as the king navigated this treacherous landscape, the question lingered. Who could they trust when the very nature of power meant that loyalty could shift like sand beneath their feet? As we look at the web of politics and betrayal, we must also consider how these internal struggles were often the precursor to the far more visible battles those fought on the fields of war. The struggles for power didn't just end within the palace walls, they spilled out into the world, where kings had to defend their thrones not only from within, but from without. The transition from court politics to military conflict was often inevitable. But before the armies could march, the kings had already faced their greatest battles, the ones fought in the shadows. When you think of a king, it's easy to imagine them riding into battle, their armour gleaming in the sunlight, leading their army to victory. We see the great conquerors, William the Conqueror, Charlemagne, and others, and we marvel at their military prowess, their ability to expand kingdoms, to crush enemies, and to create legacies that echo through history. But what we don't often see is the true cost of those victories, the toll that constant war, violence, and conquest took on the men who led their armies. Every victory came at a cost, but what if those victories destroyed the very people who achieved them? Consider William the Conqueror, the man who claimed the English throne after the Battle of Hastings. He was not just a skilled general, he was a man who led his troops to one of the most decisive victories in history. But the price of that victory was immense. The conquest of England was brutal. Thousands of lives were lost, villages were burned, and a new reign was built upon a foundation of bloodshed. William had gained a kingdom, yes, but at what personal cost? His own mental and physical health deteriorated under the strain of ruling a newly conquered territory, his reign marred by constant rebellions and the anxiety of a restless kingdom. The stress of war wasn't only external, it was deeply internal. The more battles he won, the more his health and peace of mind seemed to slip away. Victory had turned into a curse, the very land he conquered bringing him torment. His body, once strong, became a prisoner of his own empire. His health failed him, and his physical decline mirrored the dark side of conquest, the isolation, the pressure, the guilt of knowing that every victory came with the blood of his people. Then, there's Charlemagne, the legendary king of the Franks. His empire stretched across much of Europe, and yet, the cost of his military campaigns was equally high. Though he built one of the most powerful empires in medieval history, Charlemagne had to wage countless wars to maintain his dominion. The cost wasn't only in gold and lives, but in the moral toll of being a ruler who could not rest always at war, always facing the fear of revolt. His kingdom was built on the bones of those who opposed him, and though history remembers him as one of the greatest leaders, it was his constant battles that left him weary and burdened. The emotional and psychological toll of leading a kingdom through endless war cannot be overstated. A king's victories, celebrated on the surface, were often weighed down by the suffering they caused. Each new conquest added layers of stress and responsibility, eroding the king's peace of mind. What did it mean to have a crown made of gold when the weight of your people's suffering lay upon your shoulders? Wars didn't just take a physical toll, they shattered families, broke kingdoms, and left scars on the rulers themselves. To win meant to lose something just as valuable. For every soldier that marched into battle, there was another who would never return home. For every city conquered, there was a king who would forever carry the ghost of those who perished for his ambition. And though these kings sought to expand their realms, their personal lives too began to crumble under the relentless strain. In the pursuit of glory, the very men who achieved it often found themselves broken, alone, and haunted by the cost of their victories. This was the price of power, A price paid in more than just gold, it was paid in lives, in peace of mind, and in the loss of something precious. It was a toll that few could escape, for no victory came without sacrifice. As we move forward, the story of these rulers leads us to a sobering realization that the greatest cost of all may not be in the battles fought, but in the isolation and loneliness that inevitably followed. In the end, the victory may have been theirs, but the true battle was fought alone. The deeper we delve, the more we see that power's true price is often far more personal than we're ever led to believe. And the kings, though victorious, often faced their greatest battles not on the battlefield but within themselves. The crown, so often associated with power, wealth, and respect. To wear it was to stand above all others, commanding entire nations, shaping history. Yet beneath this symbol of supreme authority lay a cruel paradox. The very thing that elevated a man to the heights of influence also thrust him into an abyss of solitude. A king, though surrounded by people, was often more isolated than the poorest of his subjects. Power, it seemed, demanded a price, one that kings paid in isolation, in loneliness, and in emotional turmoil. Imagine for a moment the life of King Louis XVI. The young monarch, crowned at a time of great expectation, entered his reign with an air of hope, yet he soon found himself trapped within the cold, imposing walls of Versailles. Beneath the grandeur of his palace, where every corridor echoed with the voices of courtiers and nobles, Louis was a man alone. He could never trust anyone, not even those closest to him. His advisors, though present in every decision, were motivated by their own agendas, not his well-being. The people, too, though revering him as king, viewed him with suspicion, seeing him as distant, disconnected from their daily struggles. This isolation was not just physical, it was psychological. How could a king ever truly connect with another human being when every word, every gesture, every glance was scrutinized for ulterior motives? Louis, like many other rulers before him, was trapped in a gilded cage of his own making. His position required him to remain above reproach, to never show vulnerability, to be a symbol of unwavering strength. But what happens when the person wearing the crown is forced to face the world alone? When the weight of the crown becomes too heavy to bear, and the person beneath it longs for nothing more than a simple connection, one not shaped by politics or power. This loneliness was not unique to Louis. King Henry VIII, too, was a man whose throne was more of a prison than a pedestal. Known for his many marriages and violent temper, Henry's personal life was a tragic reflection of his reign. As his power grew, so did his isolation. His marriages, though politically advantageous, were never driven by love or companionship. Each new wife, each new political alliance, further separated him from the human connection he desperately craved. Henry surrounded himself with sycophants, yes-men, who only served to fuel his ego, yet he could never find the one thing that truly mattered: a friend, a confidant, someone who could see past the crown and simply be human with him. The lives of these kings are a sobering reminder of the cruel reality that power brings. To rule is to be alone. To stand above all others is to be separated from them by a chasm too wide to cross. The crown, despite its dazzling allure, isolates the wearer more than any prison ever could. The paradox is clear. The very thing that grants a king the ability to shape the world also robs him of the ability to experience true human connection. What is a king without someone to share his burdens, his doubts, his humanity? The more Louis and Henry sought power, the more they found themselves alone, lost in a world that demanded perfection but offered no solace. It is easy to imagine that the luxury of a king's life would provide comfort, yet this very luxury is what keeps them separated from the rest of humanity. In the quietest moments of their reigns, the ones without advisors or courtiers whispering in their ears, they must have longed for something simpler, a true connection. But the reality was far different. The higher they rose, the deeper they fell into the pit of loneliness. The question, then, becomes not one of ambition, but of survival. How does one survive, emotionally and mentally, when they are always alone? As the weight of this isolation grew, many kings, unable to bear it any longer, sought solace in the most destructive of ways. They turned to excess, indulgence, and, for some, madness. This escape from their inner turmoil wasn't just about seeking pleasure. It was a desperate attempt to fill a void too deep to ignore. But how long could a king run from his loneliness before it consumed him entirely? Kings, who lived their lives surrounded by wealth and luxury, often found themselves drawn to indulgence in ways that went far beyond simple pleasure. The lavish feasts, the fine wines, the extravagant banquets, these were not just celebrations of power and success. They were distractions, a means of dulling the pain of isolation, the suffocating weight of ruling alone. What happens when the pursuit of pleasure becomes a desperate escape from reality? For many kings, indulgence wasn't just about luxury. It was a cry for help, a silent scream against the crushing weight of their responsibilities, their loneliness. Take Caligula, the infamous Roman emperor whose name became synonymous with madness. History tells us of his grandiose excesses, his cruelty, and his descent into insanity. But what we often fail to acknowledge is that Caligula's excess wasn't just the result of power gone unchecked. It was the result of a man who, isolated by his position, turned to indulgence as a way of numbing the isolation he faced. His descent into madness was, in many ways, an inevitable response to the emotional and psychological torment of being a ruler without a true connection to anyone. Henry VIII, too, provides a compelling case study in the dangers of excess. Known for his appetites not just for food and drink, but for women, power, and control. Henry's later years were marked by indulgence and self-destruction. His constant marriages, each one an attempt to secure his legacy, were motivated not by love or companionship, but by the need to fill the emotional emptiness that plagued him. Henry's obsession with legacy, his desire for a male heir, became his undoing. As he grew older, his physical health deteriorated, and his mental state followed. The grand feasts and extravagant displays were not symbols of a thriving monarch. They were the coping mechanisms of a man who had no true solace, no true partner, no true friend. In moments of solitude, what else was left to do but indulge in the pleasures that surrounded him? The more he consumed, the more his loneliness grew, and so the cycle continued. What we see as the excesses of kings, the indulgence in food, drink, and the extravagant, are, in truth, the outward manifestations of a deep inner void. Kings, despite their power, were often the most vulnerable of men, unable to find peace in a world that demanded everything of them. The pursuit of indulgence, once a means of escape, soon becomes a destructive force in itself. The more a king tries to fill the void within him, the deeper that void becomes. The need for connection, for understanding, becomes more pressing, but the more they indulge, the more they push others away. They are trapped in a cycle, a spiral that they can never escape. The pleasures they seek only amplify the very isolation they wish to forget. As their indulgences grow, so too does their madness. It becomes clear that their descent into excess isn't just about power or privilege. It's about a desperate need to survive the emotional toll of their own reigns. The kings who turned to luxury, to indulgence, to madness, were not simply spoiled rulers. They were broken men, lost in a world they could no longer control. And in their madness, they sought answers in places even darker than the courts they ruled. The search for solace, it seemed, would take them to the very edge of reason. The indulgence, the madness, would soon give way to something even more dangerous. The occult. The search for answers from those who claimed to hold power over fate itself. But as we will see, these kings were not just looking for relief, they were looking for salvation. In the grand, labyrinthine world of royal courts, there was often one truth hidden in plain sight. The true power behind the throne was not always the one sitting upon it. Kings, despite their regal titles and immense wealth, were often powerless without the counsel of their advisors, whose influence shaped the direction of entire kingdoms. These men, often seen as mere assistants or subordinates, were the true puppeteers, their strings pulling the monarch in directions that suited their own agendas. The subtle game of manipulation that played out behind the closed doors of palaces often determined the fate of empires. What if the one person you trust most could destroy everything you've built? Take Cardinal Richelieu, for instance, a man who held more sway over the French crown than many kings would ever know. Under the reign of Louis XIII, Richelieu's influence was unmatched. Though Louis was the monarch, it was Richelieu who made the decisions, who steered the ship of state through treacherous waters. Richelieu was the true power behind the throne, and his ability to manipulate both the king and the court is legendary. His political maneuvering during the 30 Years' War, his suppression of the Huguenots, and his quest to consolidate power all painted a picture of a man who was willing to use anyone, even the king, to achieve his aims. Richelieu's success lay not in his military prowess, but in his brilliant ability to control the narrative of the court. He carefully cultivated a sense of loyalty, while at the same time fostering mistrust between the king and his other advisors. Louis XIII, though an intelligent ruler, was often overwhelmed by his responsibilities and relied heavily on Richelieu's guidance. What most historians fail to emphasize is that the king's decisions were often dictated, shaped, and filtered by Richelieu's own desires. Louis XIII may have worn the crown, but it was Richelieu who often pulled the strings behind the scenes, making decisions that altered the course of French history. Even more startling is the role of advisors who were not only politically astute, but also personally invested in shaping the future of their monarchs. Rasputin, a name that still evokes mystery and suspicion, is perhaps one of the most famous examples. The Russian mystic, who entered the court of Tsar Nicholas II under the guise of a healer, gradually became one of the most influential men in the empire. Rasputin's rise to power wasn't marked by military conquests or political skill, but by his unique relationship with the royal family. By claiming to cure the Tsar's son, Alexei, of his haemophilia, Rasputin gained the trust of the royal family. But what began as a trusted position soon spiraled into a situation where Rasputin was advising the Tsarina on matters of state. An unelected man, with no formal authority, yet holding sway over the decisions of the Russian Empire. Rasputin, like Richelieu, became a shadow ruler, guiding the Tsar and his family with a vision that was more aligned with his own desires than the needs of the nation. He convinced the royal family to trust him, using his knowledge of their personal weaknesses to control the course of Russian history. The tragic irony is that Rasputin's influence, despite being widely criticized, was not just the result of his ability to manipulate, but also because of the isolation of Tsar Nicholas II. Lacking the support of other powerful advisors and feeling cut off from the political structure of Russia, Nicholas became reliant on Rasputin for guidance. Rasputin's power didn't come from a throne. It came from his ability to exploit the king's vulnerabilities, slowly replacing the traditional power dynamics with his own. What we are left with is a disturbing reality. Those closest to the king, often trusted advisors, were in fact some of the most dangerous figures in history. Their influence was subtle, insidious, and often masked as loyalty. Kings, in their quest to rule, often handed over control to men who were more than willing to manipulate their monarchs for personal gain. In this web of power, the relationship between a king and his advisors was not one of mutual respect and trust, but a precarious balance between manipulation and necessity. As we see with Richelieu and Rasputin, it was often the advisor, not the king, who determined the fate of the empire. The manipulation of power didn't always come from an external enemy. It often came from within, from those who seemed the most trustworthy. This stark contrast between what we think of as leadership and the real power dynamics behind the scenes will reveal the true cost of having too much trust in the wrong people. For the king, the question becomes not one of external threats, but the question of internal loyalty. And as we will see in the next section, this search for trust and power often drove kings to seek answers in places even darker and more mysterious than their advisors' counsel, the occult. When all else failed, when political strategy, alliances, and advisors had done their part to guide and misguide some kings, turned to forces that could not be seen, touched, or explained. The power of the stars, the whisperings of witches, the mysterious arts of the occult, these were the tools of kings desperate for answers. When logic and strategy faltered, when the weight of ruling became too much to bear, the occult was there, offering solace in ways no courtier could provide. What if the key to a kingdom's survival wasn't strategy, but the stars? In the medieval world, kings were not just rulers of land, they were the protectors of fate itself. But what happens when a ruler believes they are no longer in control? When the uncertainty of ruling becomes too overwhelming, the need to control not just the kingdom, but the very forces of nature itself, becomes a powerful temptation. King Charles VI of France, for example, found himself overwhelmed by the belief that he was possessed by demons. His episodes of insanity were more than just personal struggles. They were seen as signs of divine displeasure, as if the very fabric of the kingdom was being torn apart by forces beyond his control. In his desperate search for answers, Charles turned to astrologers, mystics, and seers, hoping that the answers to his reign lay in the stars, or in the hands of those who could see what the common man could not. Charles's obsession with the occult became so consuming that it began to define his reign. It was said that his belief in astrology and supernatural forces was so strong that he began making decisions based on the advice of fortune-tellers, ultimately leading to a series of disastrous consequences for France. The kingdom, already in a state of crisis, suffered under the weight of a king who could no longer discern reality from superstition. What began as a search for control over his mental state soon turned into a dangerous reliance on mystical forces, a desperate attempt to find stability in a world that had become increasingly unpredictable. But Charles VI was not alone in his reliance on the occult. King Henry VI of England, like Charles, was another ruler whose reign was marked by instability and mental fragility. Henry's bouts of insanity, where he would fall into catatonic states for days, left England vulnerable to political unrest. Desperate for answers, Henry turned to the supernatural, seeking guidance from seers and mystics who claimed to have the power to commune with the divine. It is said that Henry's reliance on the occult only deepened his mental instability, leading to a series of poor decisions that culminated in the Wars of the Roses and the eventual downfall of the Plantagenet dynasty. The darker side of kingship was not just the manipulation of power by advisors or rivals. It was the quest for control over the uncontrollable. Kings, who believed they could shape their fates with magic or divine insight, risked undermining the very power they sought to preserve. The search for certainty in an uncertain world often led them to seek answers in places that no rational mind would consider. They believed that if they could only align themselves with the right forces, they could turn the tide of history in their favor. But as we've seen with Charles VI and Henry VI, the reliance on the occult didn't provide clarity. It only served to further unravel the already fragile threads of their reigns. And so, the use of the occult by medieval kings illustrates a desperate search for control, for meaning in a world that seemed to be falling apart. But what if the very forces they sought to control were, in fact, the forces that led to their undoing? As these kings turned to the mystics for answers, they unknowingly set the stage for their own downfall. The occult, in their minds, was the key to power, but in reality, it was the beginning of the end. The more they tried to shape fate, the more fate shaped them. The final chapters of their lives are written in a haze of mysticism, where the very forces they sought to manipulate eventually turned against them, sealing their tragic fates. And so, as we move forward, we begin to see how these political struggles, the isolation, and the mystical pursuits all come together in a tragic dance, leading to the inevitable downfall of many medieval kings. The higher they climbed, the harder they fell. The path to the throne is often steep, but the fall from power is swift and merciless. Kings, once seated on their thrones in absolute authority, with the weight of empires in their hands, often found themselves reduced to nothing in the blink of an eye. The tragedies of rulers like Richard II and King Charles I remind us that no matter how powerful one becomes, the forces of betrayal, war, and personal weakness can topple even the mightiest of men. Richard II, once a king destined for greatness, faced a fate that seemed unimaginable for a monarch at the height of his reign. Ascending to the throne at a young age, Richard was surrounded by a court of ambitious men, eager to carve out their own paths to power. But Richard's own weaknesses, his indecisiveness, his tendency to trust the wrong advisors, and his inability to unite his nobles set the stage for his dramatic downfall. What started as a rule filled with promise turned into a reign marked by personal insecurity and growing unrest among the nobles. But it was not a foreign enemy who overthrew Richard. His cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, would be the one to take his crown. Bolingbroke's ambition grew as Richard's mismanagement of power weakened the kingdom. The moment Richard thought he was secure, that his rule was unquestioned, he was betrayed by the very blood that ran through his veins. Henry, once a loyal member of the royal family, seized his moment and, in an act of cold calculation, forced Richard to surrender his crown. The man who once wore the crown of England was now imprisoned, dethroned by the very person he trusted most. Richard's tragic fate speaks to the heart of a king's vulnerability. No matter how high they rise, there is always someone waiting in the wings, ready to claim the power for themselves. Richard, much like many rulers before him, believed in his invincibility. But in the end, it was his own family, his own kin, who destroyed him not with swords on the battlefield, but with cunning, betrayal, and opportunism. The crown, once a symbol of ultimate power, became the very instrument of his downfall. The downfall of Richard II is not unique in history. Kings, though they may rise through great struggle, often find themselves facing an enemy they never saw coming: betrayal from within. The story of King Charles I of England mirrors this tragic theme. As a monarch, Charles I was deeply committed to his vision of absolute monarchy. He believed in the divine right of kings, that his power was ordained by God, and that no one, not even Parliament, could challenge him. But in his quest to solidify his power, Charles made one fatal mistake. He alienated those around him. His inability to compromise, his dogged pursuit of control over the English throne, led him to ignore the growing discontent within his court and Parliament. Charles's obsession with absolute power led him to take actions that pushed England into civil war. It was not just the soldiers on the battlefield that contributed to his downfall, it was the rising tide of resistance from his own people. His refusal to work with Parliament and his overreach into their territory ignited a rebellion. The very government he sought to control turned against him, and the monarchy, once a symbol of unchallengeable authority, was dismantled before his eyes. In the end, Charles was arrested, tried for treason, and executed, not by the hands of an invading foreign army, but by his own subjects, the very people he sought to rule over with unquestioned power. Charles I's execution was a watershed moment in English history. It marked the end of the divine right of kings and the beginning of a new era where rulers were no longer seen as invincible. His death did not come from a simple battle or rebellion. It was the culmination of a series of personal failures. His stubbornness, his inability to recognize the shifting political landscape, and his refusal to adapt led him down a path that resulted in the ultimate loss of his crown and his life. Like Richard II, Charles learned too late that power, once gained, is fragile, and the loyalty of those who surround you is often more fleeting than it appears. The fall of these kings reveals a grim truth about power. It is not solely the external forces that threaten a monarch's reign. Kings often face the greatest threats from within their own court, from those they trust the most. The same men who pledge loyalty can, in an instant, turn their swords against the very man who gave them power. In many ways, these betrayals are more painful than any battle fought on the field. The personal failure of these rulers, their inability to unite their people, or to see the growing discontent within their own ranks, often led to their undoing. What becomes clear through the stories of Richard II and Charles I is that a king's downfall is often not a singular event, but the result of a series of personal miscalculations, failures to adapt, and an over-reliance on the loyalty of those around them. Their once unshakable confidence in their own power slowly eroded, and they were left vulnerable to forces they could not control. Kings, for all their grandeur and wealth, were ultimately only human, vulnerable to betrayal, susceptible to personal flaws, and often unable to see the forces conspiring against them until it was too late. And so, the weight of the crown, once a symbol of supreme authority, becomes an unbearable burden. The throne, which should have been a place of stability and security, becomes a fragile perch on the edge of a precipice. The higher a king climbs, the more precarious his position becomes. In the end, it is not the battles or wars that bring them down, but the internal rot, the betrayals, the decisions that were made too late, the trust that was misplaced. And when that fall comes, it is swift and it is final. The fall of these rulers is a stark reminder that power, no matter how great, is never guaranteed. The rise and fall of kings, from the heights of glory to the depths of despair, teaches us that trust, loyalty, and human frailty are just as influential in shaping history as any battle won or lost. As we move forward in the story of these kings, we will see how their legacies are not defined by their ascension to the throne, but by the tragic way they were ultimately brought low by forces beyond their control. What remains when a king falls? Not just a throne, but a legacy that can shape the future, for better or worse. The fall of a king may seem like the end of a chapter, but in truth, it is often just the beginning of something much larger. The reverberations of a king's rise and fall echo through history, shaping societies, politics, and cultures long after their reigns have ended. Kings, though they may fall from grace, leave behind a lasting impact, sometimes a warning for future generations, and other times, an inspiration for those who seek to build upon their dreams. Napoleon Bonaparte is a prime example of this paradox. He rose from the ashes of revolution to become one of history's most iconic figures, reshaping Europe in his image. His downfall, though dramatic and swift, did not erase the marks he left on the world. Napoleon's exile to the island of St. Helena may have ended his rule, but his ideas, his vision, lived on. His legal reforms, most famously the Napoleonic Code, would go on to shape the legal systems of countless countries. His military strategies would influence generations of commanders, and his very name would become synonymous with both ambition and downfall. In the end, Napoleon's failure to secure his empire and his tragic end served as a warning to those who follow too much ambition can lead to ruin. Yet, in his failure, he also defined an entire era, with his legacy remaining deeply embedded in the history of Europe. Similarly, the fall of the Roman Empire, a story often told as the demise of one of the greatest civilizations in history, left a mark that transcended the collapse of imperial rule. The final fall of Rome in 476 CE was not just a political or military defeat. It was a cultural upheaval that would reshape the Mediterranean world for centuries. The lessons of Rome, its rise, its political intrigue, and its eventual disintegration are studied today as much as they were in the centuries following its fall. The impact of Rome's collapse on its citizens, its territories, and the development of medieval Europe cannot be overstated. It left behind a fragmented world, but one that would slowly rebuild, creating the foundation for the modern European state. The fall of Rome was not an end, but a transformation, a moment that set in motion the medieval age, with its new power dynamics and emerging social structures. In both Napoleon and the fall of Rome, we see how the failures of great kings and empires did not vanish into the pages of history. Their struggles, their miscalculations, their inevitable downfalls became the lessons of the future. Leaders who rose in the wake of these fallen kings often did so with the ghosts of their predecessors haunting their every move. The weight of failure, the consequences of unchecked power, and the lessons learned from these fallen monarchs would shape the decisions of future rulers and leaders. Even in their downfall, kings create the framework for those who follow to either rise or fall. As much as we remember the grandeur and achievements of these figures, we must not forget that their ultimate failures, whether it was Napoleon's inability to secure his empire or Rome's gradual decay, under the weight of internal corruption and external threats, defined the very path forward. Their actions have, in a sense, written the blueprint for both what to do and what to avoid in the pursuit of power. The legacy of fallen kings, thus, is a complex one. It is not only what they achieved, but also what they lost, that shapes the world long after their deaths. And so, the influence of fallen kings stretches far beyond their reigns, leaving an indelible mark on history. Their triumphs may have been fleeting, but the lessons they imparted have shaped entire generations, often in ways they could never have imagined. Even in their failure, their influence continues to echo across centuries, guiding future leaders, and serving as a reminder that the price of power is rarely paid in gold, but often in the lives and futures of those who come after. The faces may have changed, but the price of power is the same. The struggles of medieval rulers and fallen kings still echo today, their legacies reflected in the leadership challenges faced by modern political figures. While the world has evolved, the core challenges of leadership, trust, ambition, isolation, and the toll of power remain constant. Kings of the past and politicians of the present share one undeniable truth. Leadership demands sacrifices, and those who seek to wield power are often shaped by the very forces they try to control. Take Winston Churchill, for example. In many ways, Churchill's leadership during World War II mirrors the struggles of ancient kings. Like the monarchs before him, Churchill faced immense challenges that were both internal and external. He had to navigate the politics of wartime Britain, managing the demands of allies, military commanders, and a divided public. But it was not just external threats that posed the greatest danger. Churchill, like many rulers before him, faced the psychological toll of leadership, the isolation, the constant pressure, and the burden of making decisions that could alter the course of history. Churchill's struggles were not just the weight of military strategy, they were also the personal cost of leadership. His speeches inspired nations, but they also came at a price. As Prime Minister, he faced constant criticism, political infighting, and the ever-present fear that he might lead Britain to its ruin. In the shadows of his public persona, Churchill dealt with depression, a deep personal loneliness that haunted him throughout his life. He turned to alcohol and long hours of work to numb the emotional toll, much like kings before him who sought solace in indulgence. Yet, despite these personal battles, Churchill led his nation to victory, his legacy cemented in the annals of history. The price he paid for his leadership, however, was high. The very struggle for survival, the emotional and psychological cost, mirrored the turmoil faced by kings in the past. And what of modern-day leaders who rise to power, often through tumultuous paths? From heads of state in democracies to monarchs in the Middle East, the same dynamics of power, ambition, trust, isolation continue to shape their reigns. The modern politician, though not bound by divine right or absolute monarchy, still faces the same psychological burdens. The constant scrutiny, the sacrifices of personal life for public duty, the need to constantly balance the desires of the people with the demands of power. These are the eternal challenges of leadership. But what has changed since the days of kings? The faces may have changed, but the very nature of power has remained the same. Modern leaders, like those of the past, must constantly navigate the fine line between public duty and personal desire. They face pressures to maintain control, to win the trust of those around them, and to steer their countries through crises just as medieval monarchs once did. However, in today's world, the consequences of failure are amplified. Leaders are not just accountable to their courts, but to the eyes of the entire world. Media, technology, and the rapid spread of information mean that the scrutiny of a ruler's actions is more immediate and far-reaching than ever before. As we look back on the lives of past rulers, whether it was Napoleon, whose ambition led to both his rise and his fall, or the kings who sought solace in mysticism and indulgence, we must ask, are modern leaders just as vulnerable to the same traps? The psychological toll, the isolation, and the dangers of unchecked ambition are just as prevalent today as they were in the past. History may not repeat itself exactly, but the patterns of human behavior, the quest for power, the struggle to maintain it, and the consequences of losing it remain unchanged. In this sense, the legacy of the past is not just a distant memory, but a living, breathing force that shapes the leadership of today. What we learn from the rulers of ancient and medieval times is that power is as much a burden as it is a gift. The struggle for it, the sacrifices made to maintain it, and the inevitable toll it takes on those who wield it. These are the lessons that continue to resonate in the corridors of power, both in the past and in the present. As we move forward, we will explore the nature of power itself. What is it really worth, and how do the lessons of history guide the leaders of today in their own pursuit of power? The answers may surprise us, as we continue to unravel the mysteries of what it truly means to rule. Is absolute power a dream come true, or a nightmare waiting to happen? For many rulers throughout history, it began as a dream of control, of shaping the world in their image, of bending the forces of society and politics to their will. Yet, as the story of absolute power often unfolds, the very thing that was sought with such determination becomes the thing that consumes the ruler from within. It is a tragic paradox. Those who rise to power with the intent to lead often find themselves consumed by the very forces they sought to control. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, is perhaps the most iconic example of this phenomenon. His reign, which spanned over 70 years, is remembered for the immense power he wielded, the grand palaces he built, and the lavish court he cultivated. Louis famously declared, "L'État, c'est moi, I am the state." These words, uttered at the height of his reign, reveal the dangerous allure of absolute power. To Louis, his identity was inseparable from the nation he ruled. The French monarchy was not just a political institution, it was an extension of his own being. For decades, Louis XIV controlled every aspect of French life, from the political to the personal. His decisions shaped the fate of his people, and his word was law. But what happens when a ruler begins to believe that they are not just a part of the system, but the system itself? The temptation of absolute power is one that is hard to resist. It promises omnipotence, the ability to shape reality to one's own desires. But beneath the glittering facade of power lies a darker truth. The more control one gains, the more isolated they become. Louis XIV, though surrounded by courtiers and nobles, was alone in his decision-making. His absolute power left him with no true equals, no one who could challenge his vision, no one who could temper his decisions. Over time, this isolation became more than just a political consequence, it became a psychological one. Louis, like many kings before and after him, began to make decisions that were not only irrational but also self-destructive. He waged wars that drained France's treasury and led to the deaths of thousands. His lavish spending on Versailles, a palace so grand it could never truly be justified, further strained the kingdom's resources. Yet, at the time, these were not seen as errors of judgment. They were the desires of a man who believed his will was unchallenged, a man who had grown accustomed to the belief that he was invincible. His fixation on grandeur and luxury overshadowed the needs of his people, leading to growing unrest and eventually contributing to the decline of his once powerful kingdom. The psychological effects of unchecked power are profound. For a king like Louis XIV, the world was no longer a place of negotiation and compromise. It was a stage upon which he was the central actor, and everyone else played supporting roles. As his reign continued, so did his belief in his own invincibility. He surrounded himself with courtiers who flattered him, advisors who dared not challenge him, and enemies who, if they dared to voice opposition, were swiftly silenced. This concentration of power began to warp his judgment, leading to decisions that alienated his allies, strained his resources, and set in motion the decline of the French monarchy. What Louis XIV failed to recognize was that absolute power is not just about ruling with an iron fist. It is about the subtle erosion of one's ability to see beyond the self. The more power a ruler accumulates, the more difficult it becomes to distinguish their own desires from the needs of their people. They become prisoners of their own decisions, unable to break free from the bubble of their own authority. In the end, those who rise to power with the intent to control are often consumed by it, leaving behind a legacy of destruction that far outweighs any of their original ambitions. What happens when the subjects who serve you turn against you? In the game of power, there are always rebels waiting in the wings. It is a brutal truth of human history. For every ruler who seeks absolute control, there is a force, a resistance, that rises up in opposition. The higher the king climbs, the more vulnerable he becomes to the forces that will one day overthrow him. And what happens when that rebellion is not a mere whisper of dissent, but a full-blown uprising? When the people, tired of living under tyranny, decide to act, the consequences are often far-reaching and irreversible. The English Civil War is one of the most famous examples of this type of resistance. King Charles I, like many rulers before him, believed in the divine right of kings, the notion that his authority came directly from God. His reign, marked by religious conflict, political tension, and the relentless pursuit of absolute power, eventually led to a direct confrontation with his subjects. Charles's refusal to share power with Parliament, his imposition of unpopular taxes, and his attempt to suppress dissent sparked a rebellion that would lead to the downfall of the monarchy. At the heart of the English Civil War was a struggle not just for political power, but for the right to be heard. The forces that opposed Charles I, led by figures like Oliver Cromwell, understood that the king's desire for absolute control could no longer be tolerated. The rebellion was not merely an act of defiance. It was a fight for the very survival of a nation, for the preservation of a system of government where power was not concentrated in the hands of one man. The war that followed was brutal, and the consequences were far-reaching. Charles I, once a monarch at the height of his power, found himself captured, tried for treason, and executed by his own people. It was a moment in history that would forever change the trajectory of the English monarchy. The French Revolution offers another example of how rebellion can overthrow a king. King Louis XVI, like his predecessors, believed in the divine right of kings, ruling from the opulence of Versailles, indifferent to the suffering of the common people. His lavish lifestyle, coupled with the financial crisis facing France, created a volatile situation that eventually led to widespread unrest. The storming of the Bastille, the rise of revolutionary factions, and the eventual execution of Louis XVI marked the end of the monarchy and the beginning of a new era in France. The French Revolution, unlike the English Civil War, was not just a political rebellion, it was a cultural and societal transformation. The French people, fed up with the aristocracy's indifference to their suffering, sought to dismantle the entire system of monarchy. The fall of Louis XVI was not just a personal defeat, It was the collapse of a centuries-old institution. The monarchy, once thought invincible, was replaced by a republic, and France would never be the same. In both of these cases, the rebellion was not a momentary spark. It was the result of years of oppression, neglect, and miscalculation by rulers who believed in their own invincibility. Charles I and Louis XVI, though born into privilege, were ultimately undone by their refusal to understand the desires and frustrations of their people. Their absolute control, their belief that they could bend the will of the masses to their own, set the stage for their downfall. They failed to see that power, when held by one person alone, inevitably breeds resentment and defiance. What these uprisings show us is the cyclical nature of power and resistance. Kings, in their quest to control everything, often forget that the people they govern are not mere subjects. They are individuals with their own hopes, fears, and desires. The desire for freedom, the thirst for a voice in the affairs that govern their lives, is a force that no king can ever fully suppress. The rebels of history, though often outnumbered and outgunned, have a power that kings often underestimate: the power of unity, the power of a shared cause, and the power of resistance. The resistance against absolute power, as seen in the revolutions and civil wars of history, serves as a reminder that no ruler is truly invincible. Rebellion is a natural consequence of tyranny, and no matter how strong a ruler's grip on power seems, there is always the possibility of defiance. The cycle of power and rebellion is a constant reminder that the true nature of power is not to be wielded unchecked, but to be shared, respected, and above all, understood. As we consider the events of rebellion and the resistance against tyrannical rulers, it becomes clear that the downfall of these monarchs was not merely the result of external threats, but the direct consequence of their own actions, their refusal to listen, to compromise, and to understand the forces that simmered beneath their thrones. Their stories serve as a stark warning for future leaders. The price of power is high, and the cost of ignoring the voices of the people can be catastrophic. And so, as we turn to the next chapter, we will explore how history remembers these fallen rulers not just for their reigns, but for the legacies they left behind, shaped by both their triumphs and their failures. What if the kings we've idolized for centuries were not what we thought they were? History is often more fiction than fact. Over time, the stories of great kings have been spun and woven into legends, tales of glory and virtue that sometimes bear little resemblance to the men who actually lived. The mythology of royalty is shaped not only by the actions of these rulers, but also by the perceptions and desires of those who recount their stories. The truth of their reigns, often clouded by the passage of time, is replaced by narratives that serve the needs of the present. Take King Arthur, for instance. His legend is one of the most enduring in Western culture. He is painted as the ideal king, a noble ruler, a defender of justice, and a symbol of chivalric virtues. Yet, the historical evidence for Arthur's existence is scant at best. Much of what we know about Arthur comes from medieval texts, riddled with mythological elements, magical swords, legendary knights, and prophecies. Arthur's story, though rooted in the distant past, has become a blend of fact and fiction, an idealized figure whose reign represents the pinnacle of honor and courage. But what was the reality behind the legend? Did a man named Arthur ever truly sit on a throne? And if so, what were his real accomplishments, or failings, as a ruler? The truth is, history often takes the vague outlines of real events and fills in the gaps with stories that reflect the hopes, fears, and ideals of later generations. The Arthurian legend was shaped not by the life of a specific king, but by the cultural and political needs of the societies that embraced it. The king in this myth was not just a ruler. He became a symbol, a mirror of the values that people wished to see in their leaders. Whether Arthur ever existed is beside the point. His legend served to shape the way future generations would view kingship itself. Contrast this with the case of Richard III, another ruler whose legacy has been thoroughly shaped by history but in a far different way. Unlike the romanticized tale of King Arthur, Richard III's reign has been tainted by centuries of negative portrayals, most famously in Shakespeare's play, where he is depicted as a hunchbacked villain, ruthless in his pursuit of power. This portrayal has endured for centuries, overshadowing Richard's actual achievements as a ruler. In truth, Richard III made significant reforms during his time as king, working to strengthen the legal system and reduce corruption in government. But his reputation, marred by the murder of his nephews, the princes in the Tower, and the subsequent Tudor propaganda, has often obscured his real contributions to England. In Richard's case, history has rewritten his story to fit a narrative of villainy, largely because the political climate after his death demanded it. The rise of the Tudor dynasty, which succeeded Richard's rule, depended heavily on casting his reign in a negative light. Richard's downfall was used as the backdrop for the rise of Henry VII, and thus his legacy was coloured by the need to legitimize the new monarchy. The tragedy of Richard's reputation is that, like so many fallen kings, the very nature of his downfall, the political and personal struggles became the foundation for a myth that would forever alter how he was remembered. What is clear from both Arthur and Richard III is that history is not a mere collection of facts. It is a dynamic force that evolves over time, shaped by the needs and desires of those who tell the story. Kings who once might have been viewed as complex figures, with their strengths and flaws, are often reduced to symbols of either absolute heroism or undeniable villainy. The true nature of their reigns, the nuanced realities of their leadership, become secondary to the myths that surround them. The fact is, history often rewrites the stories of kings to suit the narrative needs of the present, transforming them into figures who embody either the virtues or vices that resonate with the society telling the story. As we look back at the legacies of these kings, we must ask ourselves, what are we being told about power and leadership through these myths? How do the legends of these rulers, shaped by time and circumstance, influence our own perceptions of leadership? And perhaps most importantly, how much of what we know about them is true, and how much has been carefully constructed to fit a particular view of the world? This exploration of historical mythology will naturally lead us to examine how modern leaders, too, are often shaped by the narratives surrounding them. Just as kings of the past were made into symbols of something greater than themselves, so too are contemporary politicians crafted into larger-than-life figures, their legacies moulded by the media, public perception, and political agendas. What if the image of the leader you admire is a carefully crafted illusion? Who controls the story of a king's reign? History is written by the victors, but in the modern age, it is written by the media, public relations teams, and political campaigns. The image of a leader, once crafted by court historians and playwrights, is now shaped by a multitude of forces, television networks, social media platforms, and even the very political parties that elevate them to power. Just as medieval kings were made into legends, modern leaders are often transformed into icons, their images manipulated to serve a larger narrative. Winston Churchill, for example, remains one of the most revered figures in British history. His leadership during World War II is considered one of the greatest in modern history, but his image has not always been so clear-cut. Churchill's portrayal as the resolute, defiant leader who steered Britain through its darkest hour is, in many ways, a carefully constructed narrative. While his speeches inspired a nation, Churchill was also a deeply controversial figure, known for his imperialist views, his opposition to Indian independence, and his controversial actions during the interwar years. Yet, over time, these less savoury aspects of his character have been overshadowed by the heroism of his wartime leadership. This is not to say that Churchill's achievements should be dismissed, but rather to recognise that the narrative surrounding him has been shaped to serve a particular vision of Britain's past. Similarly, modern political campaigns are built on carefully constructed images that emphasise strength, resolve, and vision, while downplaying or even hiding a candidate's flaws. From televised debates to social media campaigns, every aspect of a politician's public persona is curated to shape how they are perceived by the public. The image of a leader becomes a commodity, something to be packaged and sold, crafted to meet the desires of the electorate. Barack Obama's rise to the presidency in 2008, for example, was marked by the creation of a narrative that emphasized hope, change, and unity. His image as a charismatic, intelligent leader resonated deeply with voters who longed for a new direction after the years of George W. Bush's presidency. But the story of Obama's presidency, like all political stories, is more complex. The economic recession, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the challenges of bipartisanship were not part of the shining narrative he had cultivated, yet they were central to his time in office. The way his presidency is remembered, however, will be shaped in large part by the image he and his team worked so hard to create. In today's world, the manipulation of a leader's image is a science, a strategic effort to control the narrative, to guide the way they are remembered. Leaders are not just politicians. They are brands, carefully crafted and marketed to the public. Their legacies are not only shaped by their decisions and actions, but by how those decisions are portrayed in the media, how their images are filtered through the lens of public relations. The truth of their leadership, their real impact, becomes secondary to the story that is being told. And yet, the consequences of this manipulation are profound. Just as history has shaped the legacy of past kings, romanticizing some and vilifying others, so too does modern politics shape how we view our leaders. The political climate of the time determines which aspects of a leader's reign will be remembered and which will be forgotten. In this way, the image of a leader becomes a tool of power, a way of shaping the narrative of the past to serve the needs of the present. As we reflect on how history remembers rulers, we begin to see the dangers of allowing any one person or group to control the narrative of power. The stories we tell about our leaders, whether they are kings of old or presidents of the modern age, are not just reflections of the past. They are the tools we use to shape the future. And in that process, we must ask, are we remembering our leaders as they truly were, or are we remembering the myths we have created around them? This discussion of memory and image naturally leads us to the question of power itself. How is it sustained, manipulated, and ultimately lost? What is the true cost of power? And how does the legacy of those who wielded it shape the world that follows? As we move into the next chapter, we will explore the deeper nature of power itself, what it means to hold it, to use it, and to ultimately let it slip away. What if the price of power isn't just paid by the ruler, but by everyone who comes after them? The heavy mantle of leadership, once worn by kings, extends its weight far beyond their own reigns. It casts long shadows, influencing not just the rulers who once wielded power, but the very descendants they leave behind. Kings, for all their grandeur and wealth, often find themselves trapped in a cycle where the costs of their rule extend far beyond their lifetimes. The consequences of their decisions, both the triumphs and the failures, become the inheritance of those who follow, creating a legacy that often shapes, and sometimes destroys, the lives of their heirs. Take, for instance, the children of Henry VIII of England. Henry, the larger-than-life monarch, whose 6 marriages and break from the Catholic Church rocked the very foundations of European politics, left behind a legacy fraught with contradictions. Henry's reign, marked by ambition and turbulence, set the stage for the struggles faced by his children. His son, Edward VI, inherited the throne at the tender age of 9, burdened not only by his father's turbulent reign, but by the looming expectations of continuing the monarchy's religious reformation. Yet, Edward's reign was short-lived, and his time on the throne was plagued by ill health and political instability. His untimely death at just 15 left a nation without a clear successor, and set off a chain of events that would lead to the tumultuous reigns of Mary I and Elizabeth I. Mary, Edward's sister, ascended to the throne with a deep desire to reverse the religious changes her father had instituted. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain, a Catholic monarch, was seen as a move to restore England to Catholicism. However, her reign was fraught with controversy, marked by the brutal persecution of Protestants, earning her the infamous nickname Bloody Mary. The weight of her father's legacy and the expectations placed upon her seemed to push her toward decisions that would further fracture her kingdom. Mary's reign, though filled with ambition, ultimately ended in failure, and the religious divides left by her father's actions would continue to haunt her nation. Then, of course, there was Elizabeth I, the last of Henry's children. Unlike her siblings, Elizabeth would emerge as one of England's most successful and beloved monarchs, but even her reign was marked by the long-reaching effects of her father's decisions. Elizabeth's ascendancy was a result of political manoeuvring, and her reign was constantly threatened by the spectre of Catholic rebellion and the threat of invasion. Though she skillfully navigated these challenges, the shadow of her father's religious turmoil, the damage caused by his ruptured marriages, and the political instability they created never fully left her. Her personal life, too, was affected by the weight of the throne, her decision to never marry, and thus avoid the dynastic alliances that had doomed her mother, was in many ways a direct response to the legacy of her father's relationships and the power struggles they had wrought. In the case of Napoleon Bonaparte, the enduring cost of power can be seen even more clearly. Napoleon's rise to power was meteoric. His reforms, military genius, and vision reshaped Europe. However, his eventual downfall, culminating in his exile to St. Helena, did not end the influence of his legacy. His nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, would later claim the title of Emperor of the French, founding the Second French Empire. But the shadow of his uncle loomed large over him. Louis Napoleon's reign, though successful in many respects, was marred by the public's constant comparison to the larger-than-life figure of Napoleon. The weight of his predecessor's actions, and the perception that he was merely living in Napoleon's shadow, ultimately led to the collapse of his empire. Like Henry VIII's descendants, Louis Napoleon's rule was inseparably tied to the legacy of his relative, a legacy that both shaped and limited his own rule. The psychological toll of legacy is not merely about the power inherited from a father or ancestor. It's about the personal identity and responsibility that heirs must grapple with. The children of powerful rulers often inherit more than just wealth or land. They inherit the expectations and burdens of the throne, the pressure to live up to the ideals of their predecessors, to either continue their reforms or correct their mistakes, can weigh heavily on those who follow. It's not just the personal decisions they must make, it's the historical context in which they make them. Every action is viewed through the lens of the past, and every failure becomes a reflection of the ruler who came before. These generational struggles, this inheritance of power's toll, speaks to a deeper truth about leadership. It is never truly contained within the reign of one individual. Kings pass on their legacies, whether through the bloodline, their policies, or their failures, shaping not just their own time but the future of the kingdom. Their decisions echo across generations, shaping the lives of their heirs in ways that often exceed their own intentions. The personal costs, the emotional tolls of absolute power, ripple through the centuries, leaving marks that no throne can erase. Would you give everything for power? Or would you walk away, knowing the cost might be too great? It is the question that has echoed through the corridors of history, asked by rulers and revolutionaries, kings and commoners alike. The allure of power is undeniable. It promises control, influence, and the ability to shape the world. Yet, as we've seen with the fall of countless monarchs and the struggles of those who ascended to the throne, power often comes at a far greater price than any ruler anticipates. Throughout history, kings and queens have ascended to their thrones with grand ambitions, only to be undone by the very force they sought to wield. The price of power is not just measured in wealth or land, it is measured in the sacrifices made, the emotional toll taken, and the isolation that often accompanies the throne. Kings like Louis XIV, who sought absolute control over France, or Richard III, whose pursuit of the throne ultimately led to his own demise, paid a personal cost that few could understand. Their decisions, while made with the intention of securing their legacy, often ended in personal destruction. Their story is a tragic one of men who reached the pinnacle of power, only to find that it was a summit built on fragile ground. Yet, even in their downfall, these rulers left behind legacies that shaped the world. The question we must ask is, was it worth it? Was the price of power worth the toll it took on their souls, their families, and their nations? For some, the answer might seem clear. The grandeur, the influence, the ability to change the course of history, these are things that few can resist. But as we explore the legacies of fallen kings and the intergenerational tolls they left, we must consider the deep cost of such ambition. Perhaps it is not enough to simply ask if power is worth it. Perhaps the more profound question is whether the price of power can ever truly be understood before it's too late. Napoleon's ambition, for example, led to the reshaping of Europe, but it also left him exiled and defeated, a broken man. The kings of ancient and medieval times were often consumed by their quest for control, unable to see the emotional and psychological toll that would ultimately cripple them. In the end, their power was fleeting, their legacies often a complex mixture of triumph and failure. As we reflect on their struggles, it becomes clear that the true cost of power may not be the wealth or influence it brings, but the cost to the ruler's very humanity. The sacrifices demanded by leadership, the weight of decisions, the isolation of absolute power, and the inevitable betrayals and disappointments, all of these shape the ruler as much as the kingdom. And yet, for some, this cost is worth it. For others, the toll is too great, and they ultimately walk away from power or are overthrown by those who can no longer bear the weight. The enduring question is this: Is power, in all its glory, worth the toll it takes? Would you, as a ruler, be willing to sacrifice your soul for the ability to shape the world? Or would you walk away, knowing that the price may be too great for you to ever truly pay? The story of power is not just the story of rulers who rose and fell. It is the story of the human cost of ambition, and the eternal question of whether it is worth the price. As we move toward the conclusion of this journey through history, we are left with this final reflection. The true cost of power may not be found in the wealth it brings, nor in the legacy it leaves behind. It may be found in the very human cost that power extracts from those who seek it. And in that cost, we find the most profound question of all. What are we willing to sacrifice for power? And is it ever truly worth the price? The struggles of kings may be ancient, but the lessons they leave behind are as relevant today as ever. The rulers we have examined, from Louis XIV to Napoleon, from Richard III to Henry VIII, stand as symbols of both greatness and tragedy. Their lives, filled with ambition, power, and ultimately downfall, mirror the eternal human struggle for control and legacy. Though their names have long faded from the headlines, their stories continue to resonate because they speak to something deeper, something universal. The struggles they faced, the cost they paid, are not confined to the pages of history. They live on in the hearts and minds of leaders, politicians, and anyone who seeks to wield power. We've seen how the weight of absolute power can warp the mind of a ruler, turning even the noblest into tyrants. The temptation of unchecked authority leads to isolation, corruption, and ultimately ruin. The more power a king gains, the further removed he becomes from the reality of his people. He starts to believe that the crown is an extension of himself, that his will is absolute, and that his vision of the world is the only one that matters. In this delusion, he loses touch with the very people he is supposed to lead, and this disconnect is often the seed of his downfall. We've also witnessed the relentless toll that power takes not just on the ruler, but on those around him. The burden of leadership extends beyond the crown. It echoes through the lives of the king's family, his advisors, and his people. Kings, for all their wealth and influence, were often the most isolated individuals in their realm. The very nature of power, its ability to shape reality, also alienates those who wield it. The personal cost of leadership can be staggering, as we have seen in the lives of rulers who faced betrayal, rebellion, and the disillusionment of their own ambitions. But perhaps the most enduring lesson from these kings is the cyclical nature of power itself. Rulers who rise with grand promises often fall prey to the same forces they once controlled. Their reigns become defined by the mistakes they made, the relationships they damaged, and the illusions they believed. And in their fall, they leave behind legacies that shape the world for generations. Their lives are not just stories of rise and ruin, they are cautionary tales that continue to inform how we view leadership today. As we reflect on the kings of the past, we are reminded that power, no matter how alluring, is never without its costs. The desire to rule, to shape history, comes with the responsibility of understanding the human cost of leadership. It is a truth that transcends time. Those who seek power must always be aware of the sacrifices it demands, not only from themselves but from those they lead. The struggles of kings were not just political, they were deeply personal, emotional, and psychological. These lessons from the past are more than just historical, they are universal. The same questions about ambition, leadership, and legacy continue to haunt modern leaders. The cost of power is not something we leave behind in history. It is something we must confront in the present, in our own lives, and in the leaders we choose to follow. The struggles we've witnessed in the lives of these rulers are not just the story of kings, they are the story of all who seek to lead. The desire for power, the isolation that comes with it, the mistakes made in its pursuit, these are the timeless struggles that shape not just history, but the present and future. As we move into the final reflections of this journey, it's important to remember that the lessons of the past are not just stories of bygone monarchs. They are the mirror in which we must examine our own aspirations, our own leadership, and the costs we are willing to pay for power. So, what have we learned? That the crown is not just an emblem of power, it's a symbol of sacrifice, tragedy, and the eternal question of what it truly costs to lead. As we've explored the lives of kings, we've seen how the allure of power can both elevate and destroy. These rulers, who once stood at the pinnacle of their realms, often fell as quickly as they rose, undone by the very forces they sought to control. Their ambition, their desire for greatness, led them down paths of isolation, corruption, and ultimately, failure. But in their stories, we also find the most profound question of all: is power worth the price? History's great rulers, whether they succeeded or failed, have all faced the same fundamental question: what is the cost of leadership? How much must one sacrifice to hold power, and what remains when that power slips away? The kings we've studied, from the grandiose Louis XIV to the tragic Napoleon, left behind legacies that transcend their actions. Their struggles, their decisions, and their downfalls have shaped the world in ways that still affect us today. Yet, the true cost of their power was often paid in silence, hidden in the recesses of their personal lives, their relationships, and their very souls. The fall of Richard III, the execution of Charles I, the rise and fall of Napoleon, all these stories point to a central truth about power: it is never guaranteed, and its price is often more than one can bear. Power isolates, corrupts, and consumes. The rulers we admire for their achievements are often the same ones whose failures have left a deep mark on history. But perhaps, in their failings, we find the most important lessons of all. The cost of leadership is not just measured in the blood of wars fought or the riches accumulated. It is measured in the toll it takes on the individual. Kings may have sat upon thrones of gold, but those thrones were often built upon a foundation of personal sacrifice. The crown, once seen as a symbol of unchallenged authority, becomes, in the end, a weight too heavy for even the strongest rulers to bear. In the pursuit of power, they lost their humanity, their relationships, and sometimes their very sanity. And yet, despite all this, many would do it all again. What does this mean for us today? Are we too willing to pay the price for power? We may not sit on thrones or wield armies, but the pursuit of leadership, influence, and success carries with it the same burdens. We are all, in some way, leaders in our own lives. We lead our families, our teams, and our communities. The lessons of kings serve as a reminder that leadership, no matter how grand or humble, comes with its own sacrifices. The price of power is not always evident at first, but over time, it reveals itself in ways that cannot be ignored. As we reflect on the legacies of the kings we've explored, we are left with a profound question: is power worth the cost? Would we, in their place, choose the crown, knowing the price we would have to pay? The answer, perhaps, is not as simple as we might think. For those who seek power, the cost is often invisible until it is too late. And in that cost, we find the most enduring lesson of all: the price of power is high, and sometimes it is not worth the price. As we close this chapter on the legacy of power, we are reminded that the story of kings is not just the story of the past, it is the story of us all. The struggle for power, the weight of leadership, and the cost of ambition are universal. The kings we've studied are not just distant figures in history, they are reflections of our own struggles, our own desires, and our own fears. The true legacy of power is not what it grants, but what it takes away. And in that, we find the most profound truth. Power, when sought without understanding its true cost, can lead not to glory, but to ruin. As we leave this story behind, we must ask ourselves, what are we willing to sacrifice in the pursuit of power? And, perhaps more importantly, what are we willing to lose?